Welcome everybody to episode 312 of Fergon the Freak. My name is the Glorious League Freak, and we have two very special guests on today. They are co-founders of Gainline Analytics. It is Ben Darwin, who has been on before, and Simon Strachan. How are you both?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, good, Freaky.
So it's an interesting time for you to both come on because there's kind of a few different storylines that are coming together at the same time. We've had COVID that has been a mess for teams and seasons. We've got the State of Origin teams have been selected, and we've got a real outlier in the NRL season in the Penrith Panthers. So it's a cool time to have you both on. So first of all, how have the COVID stoppages and changes in the regular season formats affected the calculation of cohesion across all the different sports that is both cover?
I think the first things first is that COVID becomes this really interesting experiment, and the experiment first of all comes with home and away. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that people say is that you play a home game, you should win more games. And in the NRL, I think home team wins 56% of games. Well, when they started removing crowds last year, that started to drop. So that was the first thing that came up across all of sport, is that we were finding that crowds, not so much being in your hometown, was actually making the difference.
Oh, yeah.
And they actually did a study in the EPL a couple of years ago and found that for every 10,000 more people in the crowd, the referee gets more bias in terms of their decision making. And so it turns out referees are human. So that was the first thing that came out. The second, with a shorter season last year, is that it actually did not give enough time for the uncohesive teams to get their houses in order. Mm-hmm. And so the number one, the final was number one versus number two for cohesion, and that's a rating we use called TWI, which we have at the start of the season. We've got in-match ones, so that certainly began to affect it. And the other components, which we may or may not get to, is, for example, if they end up playing a grand final away from home. I don't know if you want to touch on that, Simon, but how hard it is for the interstate clubs.
Yeah, so one thing we found over the, at least the last 20 years when I've looked at it, that it's actually really, really hard for interstate clubs to win the grand final. We actually see this in other sports as well. It's really prevalent in the AFL. Mm-hmm. But effectively, you're playing a grand final in sort of a home stadium to a lot of the other clubs, and so the interstate teams actually have to be a lot stronger to actually win. So, because when we do our sort of game analysis, we know basically by the markers that the away team has to be stronger than the home team, because obviously there's home ground advantage associated, and some of that home ground advantage is what Ben talked about there. And so the away team effectively has to be stronger. And so when you do have the interstate teams, they've tended to always be these dynasties where, the Melbourne Storm, Brisbane Broncos, the Knights for that sort of 97, 2001 period. I mean, the Cowboys, when they won in 15, they were really strong, but they, unlike the other interstate teams, they dropped off reasonably quickly. I had some issues sort of on the way, but effectively to be an interstate team, you've basically got to be able to build it strong in that way to overcome that, effectively that you're playing away come that grand final period.
And does that effect of being away, does that go up if you've got further to travel? Do you factor that into the statistics?
We don't. Anecdotally, we understand that it's there. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, if the Western Reds were still in the competition, they'd have a massive advantage. Mm-hmm. Especially if the Auckland Warriors were travelling to Perth or Perth were travelling to Auckland, that would be a difference. But when you've got clubs within Sydney playing within Sydney, it's not so much. You've got clubs going up the eastern coast, it's not so much. Mm-hmm. But it really comes down to, and I think a lot of the evidence and what Ben talked about is that influence on the crowds, and that's where a lot of the data and what COVID has given us is that ability to understand the influence of crowds on referee decisions and what that happens during that time during the game and without crowds, what's influenced that happen. So, Ben's done some stuff. He looked at Super Rugby over a period of time and the implications of travel there. So there is an influence, but the biggest influence of what we see is around the influence of the crowd on the outcome of the game on the day.
Well, that's really cool because I don't think I've ever heard anybody showing statistically that the penalties in a game are influenced by not just it being the venue, but the actual number of fans. That's fantastic.
I saw another. This is an AFL one. It's been 20 years since the West Coast Eagles had more penalties against them in a game than for them.
Oh wow!
Yeah, that says something about. I think it's a combination of a number of factors. Obviously, travelling across the West, but also the influence of the crowd, because I can't imagine that many opposition supporters travel.
Is that just in home games, Simon?
Yeah. Just in. Sorry, it's across the league. So, gotcha. But I imagine it is significantly influenced by their home games.
Yeah, it's offset because they get so many for them at home.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. Now, this NRL season's been a little bit strange because we've got some teams that have been, we've got the Panthers who are kind of this real anomaly compared to everyone else, just looking at it from a fan's perspective. And then you've got other teams like the Bulldogs who are just so out of the competition. It's incredible how bad they look. Does that show up in the statistics as well, that their cohesion stats between, say, a Bulldogs team and the Panthers are so ridiculously different?
So the thing to understand, first of all, is that the league generally has been getting more and more cohesive since the Super League war.
Okay, yep.
So that was very destabilising. And if you remember when the Super League war hit, the first thing that kind of happened was a couple of clubs stayed together, Brisbane, Manly, Newcastle, when the Chiefs getting on the bus and going down, signing everyone up. Like that manifested itself within a year of Newcastle beating Manly in the grand final and Brisbane beating all comers, basically. So, and then you add all these other clubs, and those clubs take from other clubs. They take oftentimes from the weaker clubs. So you had this huge destabilising influence, which allowed Storm to grab players from another club themselves and win the grand final in 1999.
Yeah, they got it
since
from
that point,
about two different clubs and put them together with a few extras. Yeah,
there's a lot of Newcastle second grade / Hunter Mariners, in that side, and also they were unbelievably stable in their first 2 years. We've never seen a team that stable, and oftentimes that's got to do with if you don't have expectations, you're allowed to lose.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is too, they got players at the right time, and as you say, we've never seen an expansion club where their team was set, and it didn't need to really be changed too much.
I think Brisbane in '88 was probably the closest to that. They started with a lot of already, I think Wynnum Manly is at an 86 or 87, had about 4 or 5 players in the Australian team, so that kind of formed a core for Brisbane, and they won a lot of their games early, and they took large amounts of shared experience from Queensland and those guys.
Okay, let's talk about the Penrith Panthers then. They're an anomaly in the sense that they're a young team that are going extremely well. On top of that, they're going well compared to historic teams anyway in the NRL's history. Are their cohesion stats just off the chart, showing that this is what they almost should be doing anyway?
I would say they're not an anomaly as far as we're concerned. They're just an anomaly in the NRL because they've set themselves up similar to a model of, say, the Crusaders. They're actually quite hard to measure because a lot of the components around them are through their juniors. And so that's harder. You got to go back to look at the Harold Matthews and all those competitions historically. But the thing is that people generally think that experience equals success, and across all sports, that is generally the case, but it's oftentimes if you have experience with cohesion. Mm-hmm. So when you have experience with no cohesion, there's a year a couple of years ago where Parramatta Eels had the most experienced team in the comp, became last.
Yeah.
So the Penrith are less experienced than everyone else right now, or right at the bottom, but they have experience, no experience with cohesion, and that means they're performing very, very well, and they're almost kind of outstorming the storm, as I would describe it. And they've just taken it a lot deeper and done it with a lot more planning, and the results are there. And particularly, they're not that much better in attack. The difference is in defence.
Yeah, and their defence is I've never seen a team defend like Penrith. It's like the best teams I've seen are the Manly Seagulls of the mid-90s, and this Penrith team I think beats them, and it's incredible seeing what they're doing on defence. Do you have, in the cohesion ratings, do you have anything that separates attack and defence?
Simon?
Yeah, so we basically got a whole myriad of markers. So we look at the overall team strength. Mm-hmm. We look at the strength of the spine. We look at effectively the weaknesses of the team. We look at the weaknesses of the spine. So we break the team up into the various units, and so we can use that to compare team against team. So understanding team strength versus opposition weakness, opposition strength versus team weakness, and so that gives us a really good idea around outcome. The thing about the Penrith at the moment, they have some of the best defensive markers in the competition, which is obviously reflective of their defensive ability. So their ability to defend is very high because they don't have many cohesion weaknesses across their team. And it's just the nature of the way as a group they've been put together.
Now, I guess this all leads into my next question, which is how difficult has it been to mesh the cohesion ratings between the NRL clubs and their reserve grade teams and lower grade teams since the COVID break, because we've had the New South Wales Cup stopped being played. A lot of lower grades were very stop-start. Some of them were just cancelled altogether. And so how do you take, say, the cohesion ratings in, say, New South Wales Cup, when the competition stops, does all of that reset again?
The easiest way to describe it is we look at it more along the lines of we measure first grade, but we look at the club as a system. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, for example, Brisbane have multiple feeder clubs for the reserve grade. In fact, most of the Queensland clubs have that type of system. Whereas, say, Penrith have their reserve grade is Penrith Panthers. The other type is what we would call an affiliate model, which is a Sydney club using a club like, say, Mounties. And they jump around so much, it's actually quite hard to keep track on which club is that set up. So we look at what's called TWI, which, of course, you've got like the Storm and Penrith have very high markers for TWI. And then we look at a notion which we call sort of like singularity, which is do you have one club underneath you, or do you have two, or do you have three? I think as we get more complex and we get a greater level of understanding, one of the hardest parts is getting the right records. Because if you measure reserve grade, you've got to measure reserve grade all the way back, as far as you can.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like the next step for us. And also things like Holden Cup, Harold Matthews under 16s. I mean, most clubs don't generally use their lower grades particularly well.
Yeah.
And I know Phil Gould's banging on a lot about this at the moment. I'd be interested to see if he can pull off what he did at Auckland comparative to what he did in Penrith. Because Penrith is a big system, but it was reasonably easily aligned, whereas Auckland seems like a tough cookie to crack.
Yeah, and the thing, like, I can't believe that every team isn't looking at what Penrith has done with its junior system and just trying to copy it all. But you need the numbers to do it as well. That's why I don't understand why a team like the West Tigers isn't looking at it. And, Auckland's another one, as you say. If they get it right, it will be as good, if not better, than what the Panthers have done. But it is such a big task because there's so many influencing factors on their junior system as well over there, whereas Penrith's junior system is relatively stable in the junior area, and it's more, I guess you could say, compact in the area. Like Auckland is almost drawing on all of New Zealand, which is a big task.
I think too that generally the perspective is with boards is that they always feel like they can just acquire the talent or acquire the coach.
Yep.
And that's going to fix the problem rather than taking a systematic view. Simon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been internally, without actually understanding the nuts and bolts of the decisions made inside Penrith, it looks like that's the path they went down. But the decisions they made were made easier by those junior grades being successful. Mm-hmm. Now, we would advocate that you don't necessarily need to have successful junior grades to be successful in the first team, because by the nature of the way you've put it together. But the fact that they have been successful has just made those decisions easier and more palatable. And in the end, it's turned that way on the field. And so other teams looking at that model might be saying, okay, I understand what's happened at Penrith, but a lot of their success now has come from success previously, where that's not necessarily the case. Like, you don't necessarily need that success. What you need is that pathway of those players coming through in that way. So that's where, from, in retrospect, it's potentially easy to say, oh yeah, we should just copy what Penrith did. In retrospect, it's probably easy to say that because of the way it's turned out. It's probably harder. It's probably a leap of faith for other organisations to be able to do it and not necessarily have the same level of success in the junior grades.
Yeah.
I would say though that they had that success in the 20s, but that group wasn't necessarily the most successful under 16s. I think part of their success in the 20s was because they held that group together.
Yeah.
So they went through that process from 16s and it held through 18s, and then the success came in the 20s. Manchester United had a very famous version, which was the class of 92, and they actually played an FA Cup under 16s tournament, and they played in a final. They got beaten very soundly by Leeds United 3-1, and this was Nicky Butt, Gary Neville, Beckham, Giggs, all those guys. And so you sort of think to yourself, what happened to all those guys who were in Leeds? And none of them went anywhere. Even though they were actually a more successful team. And I think that's the sort of question a lot of the time, is that every club has good juniors, but what happens to them? So, the Knights in 15, I think, won the under-20s, had a really good juniors team, and what's happened to those guys? Where have they gone?
Yeah.
Also, we know that good players can come out of losing junior teams. It happens all the time.
Yeah, and I guess that's whoever can work that out is, they're the greatest coach / manager of all time, because we've all seen those junior players who you think are a lock, and for whatever reason it just doesn't work out. They find other interests. They don't progress like other players who have maybe less talent at the same age, and there's really no rhyme or reason for it, really, when you look at it.
I think there's a model we've been talking about, which is absorption, which Simon's looked at quite a bit more. Do you want to explain that, Simon?
Yeah, so we found this a lot in the Premier League in the UK, and in fact also in UK Rugby League, in Super League, around how the academy, how players from the academy develop into the first team. And it's not necessarily, the quality of the academy is not necessarily a function of the academy itself or the perception of the quality. It's more about the first team. You can have two academies producing just as quality players, but if they go into a low cohesion environment in the first team, they're not going to look as good. They're not going to have an understanding with the other players. They're not going to be able to play to capacity, and it's going to look like that they are poor players, and that's going to be a reflection of the academy itself. Where you've got a guy coming out of, say, the Wigan or the St Helens Academy that's going to go into a highly cohesive team, and those academies get lauded all the time because of that reason. It's like the talent spotting from the Melbourne Storm. You go into the Melbourne Storm environment, everyone knows which way they're playing. You are going to play to capacity all the time, and so if your first team is highly cohesive, it's not necessarily how or the function of what's happening underneath. It's that player's going to be allowed to play to capacity once they get there.
And does that Does the cohesiveness of that team that a junior player comes into, even if that team is not going very well on the field, that first grade team, as long as the cohesion is high, does that help those junior players become better players rather than a team that's maybe going just a little bit better but their cohesion is really low?
Yeah, so if the cohesion of the first team is low, it's generally going to reflect poorly on that player coming in, because you're going to have players uncertain about what they need to do on the field. In the defensive line, what the person's next to them is going to do. In the spine, passing to ghosts, and so it's not this. It's generally going to reflect poorly on the person coming in to that first team.
Yeah, because
the cohesion of the team will also generally reflect in the performance anyway.
Yeah.
But I think if you want an example of any of this, it's Cameron Smith.
Yeah.
I don't think he would have become Cameron Smith at Parramatta.
No.
I don't think he would have made it. And so if the Storm had taken someone else, that person might have become Cameron Smith.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that starts messing with your mind, is it's actually not so much about who they take, it's what they come into.
Mm-hmm.
Because there really wasn't a lot of evidence that he was going to become Cameron Smith, or that Slater or Cronk, from an early age, they weren't doing exceptionally except together at Brisbane North.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of notion of absorption starts to get really interesting when you think about, well, what if they got someone else? Because no one else really looked at Cameron Smith. The Broncos didn't want him.
No. And the thing is too, and we've talked about this on the podcast, he's not the biggest, he's not the strongest, he's not the fastest. And one of the big things about his career, especially as it went on, was he's got so much experience and so much winning experience, and he knows what to do in the big games because his teams are always in the big games. But one day he ran out and he was a rookie just like everyone else. And if he ran out as a rookie for, a team like the Eels or, a team like the Titans, his career goes in a completely different direction. He doesn't get that experience. He doesn't get all of those winning experiences.
So I think too, the example I like to give is when he goes up as well to the representational teams, he takes Melbourne Storm with him.
Yes.
And I always give the example of when Cherry Evans played State of Origin, down here in Melbourne, he had a difficult night.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when Munster comes in instead, he comes on, he gets man of the match and they win by 50.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Munster's not that much better than Cherry Evans. I'm not that much of an opinion on spine players, but he can't be that much better. But that's the context. It's the context of the scenario, who he's coming up with, who he's playing with. It's just so much easier for Munster in that scenario than Cherry Evans.
I like the story of, I think, Jerome Hughes. I mean, he's not Cameron Smith. He's doing all right at the Storm. The Storm is his third club. So two other clubs potentially said this isn't the right guy for us. So they saw something about him that wasn't right. But he's sort of doing all right now.
Yeah, and I know when they went with him as halfback, and I was on this podcast saying it's not going to work. You need a halfback. They can't do it with a makeshift halfback. And, of course, they went on to do it with a makeshift halfback. But if you look at it along the lines of what you're both saying, it's, because he come into a really good environment. He had a very simple job. He knew what to do. And Bellamy's fantastic at getting a player in and saying, I just want you to do this to start with. And eventually over time that cohesion builds with his teammates that already had cohesion, and they go on to do some amazing things, even though Hughes isn't a traditional halfback.
Simon?
Sorry.
Yeah. And that's where you feel, I mean, your opening question a while ago about the Bulldogs, and that's where you feel for a lot of the Bulldogs players. It's not their fault that they are in a very low cohesive environment. So as a team, they're not going to perform. They're going to look poor, and it is sometimes reflective of them as players and the organisation. Well, it's reflective on the organisation because they've built it that way.
Yeah.
But it's also reflective on the players, and it's not necessarily the players' fault because of the nature of the way the team's been put together.
Yeah, and you can see that with, and I've said this year, they're a better team in terms of talent this year, and their performances are not as good this year because, it's weird. It shouldn't be that way by the eye test, but if you look at the cohesion stats, I'm sure that they're lower this year than they were under Dean Pay, for instance, where he didn't have the same cattle to work with, but they were together for at least a little bit of time, so he could build something with them.
The hard part about this is you do what's called back ending, which is you improve as the season goes, but that's if you don't make changes.
Mm-hmm.
And the hard part is making changes when you lose is the most common thing people do.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is you keep making changes when you lose, then the market actually goes ahead of you. You get accelerated away. Whereas if you don't make changes when you lose, you improve and then you start winning games towards the back end of the season. And you can see that right now with Wests.
Mm-hmm. And I think you saw it last year with the Broncos a lot.
Yeah, they had an okay start and then plummeted right down in terms of numbers, and then again towards the end, it comes back up. But there's this kind of panic that takes place, and the problem is people's jobs are on the line.
Mm-hmm.
We talk to a lot of coaches, and they'll say, "What you're saying is right, but I can't afford to not make changes because the board's asking for it, or they're telling me, I've got to keep my job," and that interest sometimes of holding onto your job is more important than development at the club. And, we would probably look at a season and say, okay, probably 6 teams are capable of winning it, maybe 8 if you get a huge amount of luck. So for example, Cronulla, a number of years ago had this season where they lost 3 of their first 4, but they just kept the same team all the way through and went from, I think, 13th to 2nd or something for Cohesion, got a home grand final, won it. You can jag it.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, you need to think in seasons, in chains. This season leads on to next. What are the decisions we make? You get this strange scenario whereby you have clubs playing players who aren't going to play next year.
Yeah.
And not going to make the 8. Like, why would you do that?
It makes no sense to me. And that's why I think this year we've seen the Brisbane Broncos. Tom Dearden's a really good example. He decided to go to North Queensland next year, and they were like, that's fine, but we can't build around you, so you're straight down to reserve grade. And now he's up at North Queensland now. Like, he moved on immediately. And I've never understood that either, where they'll keep a player in their team, or even a team that is losing really badly that has older players, and they keep running out those older players. And those older players are moving on either that off season or the following season, and they're not putting their juniors out there and giving them a go, seeing what they can do together.
Yep, 100%. And that's the problem, is that, do you have permission to fail?
Yeah, and as you say, it's all about keeping your job if you're a coach, and no one wants to build the next guy's super team.
Yeah, and so I think that this is the great difficulty, and the best example I've ever seen of this was Kevin Sheedy when he was at GWS. He would come out knowing they were going to lose games by 150 points. It just was the reality of it. And the AFL is the highest cohesion league in the world, so it takes the longest to build clubs. Mm-hmm. So he knew he was going to lose every game that year, or maybe win one, and as hopeful. But he still coached as though he was a winning coach.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we see a lot of the time too is it's almost like the situation of losing crushes coaches.
Yeah.
And they lose their motivation, and you can see them sitting in the box just like grumpy as all hell, when what's actually happening is his team's playing to potential. The problem is the potential is so poor because the setup is so poor.
Yep.
And part of the problem is coaches make promises when they interview that they can't deliver on.
Yeah.
And they just expect, I'm going to be able to sort it out, but I've got to get the job first. And the boards want to hear certain things in interviews, and the coach may not be capable of that. We know that all the coaches we've found, no one can really function above capacity. In other words, people can't take poorly put together clubs and win with any consistency.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore they are going to lose games, so therefore they need to get people comfortable with that. And the problem is when you interview for the job, you're not going to walk in and say, this is going to take a long time. This place is a train wreck. You know, I'm going to lose 15 games in the first year. They'll never hire you.
Yeah. It's like, generals at wartime. The ones that are successful aren't the ones that go in and tell you what they can't do.
Yes. Yeah. But the club is so much more than the coach.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the setup first and the philosophy of the board that influences the performance.
At least there's I think some clubs have at least taken, they've taken the pain for a long period of time that they were able to sort of sit there and go, okay, well, what do we have to do? I think the Titans are a good one that have actually been able to understand potentially the long-term drivers and then turn around and have more of a long-term vision behind it. Because obviously, mentioned this earlier about sort of their original setup was very much in the short term, but that's sort of switching to the longer term, which is positive for them going forward if they maintain it, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting about the coaches. It seems like every team wants to have the next Craig Bellamy, but they want it in the next 18 months, not realising that he's been there for like 15 plus years, and that's why he's Craig Bellamy.
Yeah, the issue there is it's everyone thinks Craig Bellamy, but it's the Craig Bellamy and Frank Panisi show. That's the thing. You wouldn't have Craig Bellamy without Frank Panisi. So
I think if you look at it from the perspective of Henjack is now, Cleary, my apologies. Cleary is now at a club built similar to the Storm,
mm-hmm.
and he looks like a genius.
Mm-hmm.
But Tigers also signed the same guy,
mm-hmm.
and that did not work out. And even when he was at Penrith the first time, it didn't necessarily work out because they were in the early stages of that construction. So are we seeing Bellamy as a genius because he's a genius, or are we seeing Bellamy as a genius because of the setup?
Yeah.
I mean, we know his State of Origin record's terrible, but if he went to another club, would he be able, if he went to the Bulldogs tomorrow, could he rebuild the Bulldogs and have enough time and overcome the problems with the board? Because we do see that at a lot of clubs where they'll go and get, a rich benefactor will go and get, let's say Tinkler at the Knights. He goes and gets Bennett, expecting Bennett to do what Bennett does, and he can't do it.
Mm-hmm. And
all of a sudden we say, oh, Bennett's not what he was anymore, and now he's back at South and he's good again.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the weird one with Penrith is that they had Ivan Cleary, who was putting together the base of what we've got today, and then he moves on, and they bring in Griffin, who basically picks up the mantle a bit, and the club just keeps going towards where it is today. They get rid of him, bring in Cleary, but it's really the club has been on the one journey, and as long as you've got someone that's not a catastrophically bad coach, they're going to just do the right job, and as long as the infrastructure's there, the club will go in the right direction. The coaches can't be miracle makers.
Well, in 2013, I think their TWO was second last, something like that. And it's just kept going up every year since then.
Yeah.
And so they've just been part of that journey. And if you make it about the system and not about the coach, and even not about the player, if they dumped their first grade, but they kept the system going, you think they'd probably put it back together again in a couple of years. And that's what you want to be able to do to make this kind of thing renewable and not about an individual, because then you start to get into this language of holding together a golden generation,
mm-hmm.
and then you tend to overdo it. So Brisbane Lions had a similar scenario in 2004, is they held everybody together because they knew they'd make it successful, but they didn't know if they could renew it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to actually keep renewing it. We've spoken to clubs that said, we wish we'd gotten rid of our superstar earlier because we missed out on the next generation of kids coming through. And you've got to be able to convince your fans that's the right way to do it. And the best one of that, of course, was Sir Alex Ferguson, is he got rid of Ronaldo, he got rid of Beckham when their time was done, and they kept winning.
Mm-hmm.
That's the hard part. That's the hard part, is that succession planning.
Now, it's State of Origin time. We haven't heard the Queensland team just yet, but last year's State of Origin series was a little bit different, and Queensland was supposed to get flogged, and of course they won the series because that's what they do. Was there anything in the statistics that said to both of you that Queensland team was either going to win the series or at the very least do better than everyone else expected?
Simon, do you want to speak to
that? So it's interesting, State of Origin over the last few years, sort of the numbers, especially for Queensland, have obviously dropped quite a lot just because of the nature of who they've got, which was probably pretty reflective of the season before in that. The biggest standout last year was through the Blues selection, in the fact that they they basically threw the centres. They didn't choose centres in the centres. And so what we're finding is around sort of catastrophic weaknesses in sort of defensive areas on the edges, that they can if they are found out, they can be exploited pretty well. So one of the differences we felt last year was that, which again with this new Blues team that's put out with Mitchell and who's the other centre?
Trbojevic.
Yeah,
yep.
Being chosen in the centres, there's a little bit of a red flag against that coming into this. But ultimately, it is team against team. So the context is who they're up against in that way. Is there going to be a Queensland spine that's going to be able to exploit that in that way? But sometimes when the numbers are really, really low, which they have been over the last couple of years, it just comes down to individual skill sometimes. Ben?
Yeah, I think that across, if you look at the Queensland team 5 years ago, the numbers were absolutely spectacular. And most of that was coming out of Broncos, Storm, Cowboys.
Yeah.
That was the form, because they're not playing enough as Queensland. And it's almost like New South Wales every year was trying to find a combination that could pull it off. And the thing with combinations, you don't find combinations, you build combinations.
Yeah.
So that was the difficulty for New South Wales during that period, is they didn't really have them in New South Wales because most of the clubs in New South Wales weren't built that well at that point. Now we've got a different scenario. No clubs really are forming the basis, except if New South Wales perhaps went down more of a Penrith line, and I know Joey Johns is starting to sort of talk in these terms, is that they could theoretically put that together. And then there's also, which guys are qualified to play for New South Wales in their series. So generally the whole thing has come down in terms of cohesion over the last 2 years. And then it just becomes about where the fault lines are, and there's fault lines everywhere in both teams now.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you can have maybe two teams that overall their cohesion isn't high for one of the teams compared to the other team, although in State of Origin it sounds like they're both generally a little lower than normal at the moment. But if one team has a glaring weakness or a hole in it, that can be seen as something that the lower cohesion team overall can exploit. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. So it really comes down to individual relationships on the field. You've got positional understanding, you've got system understanding. So if a guy's never played, for example, man-on-man defence versus zone defence, I'm using a rugby term here, but if they're not used to certain aspects, there's different forms of cohesion. So there's system, there's people, and there's role.
Yep.
And so when you pick guys playing out of position, you get ambiguity, you get confusion. When you've got people playing next to each other, they've never played with each other, you get the same type of scenario. So, and with both teams, they're all over the shop. The key is there's certain, obviously within the sides, within the edges are extremely important. And so when you have ambiguity and confusion in those edges, that's much more telling than up the middle.
And I mean, one of the pluses, a big plus for the New South Wales team, is having Luai and Cleary in the halves. Obviously coming out of Penrith, and Cleary's obviously spent a bit of time with Tedesco and Cook obviously in Origin, so there's a reasonable amount of time together in that spine. But in saying that, it's where the sort of the edges the edges of the edge is a critical one, sort of the inside of the left and right edge. If there are sort of big gaps in there, they can be exploited pretty well. So, you know, likewise, like I said, with New South Wales, with having those centres who aren't centres, not only do you have a lack of positional understanding, but you tend to have a high level of lack of understanding with the players around you. And so having a high understanding with the halves is good, but then, you know, working off the halves, having some level of understanding it helps in it from an attack perspective and also from a defence perspective.
It's interesting that you say that, because I remember when we first talked to Ben about cohesion, and it was always stuck with me, and my New South Wales team would have had Matt Burton and Stephen Crichton in it for the same reason of, you know, having that cohesion between the edges of the team and the halves. And I knew that, and I didn't get around to it, unfortunately, but I knew if I put my New South Wales team out and it didn't have Tom Trbojevic in it or Latrell Mitchell in it, people were going to go off their heads and think I was a Panthers homer. But, yeah, I would have gone with the Panthers centres, to be honest, for that reason. You know, they've been playing there almost all season. They've got their teammates on the inside of them. They're comfortable in their roles. We've seen that for the Panthers. So it was interesting that they went with the two fullbacks, full-time fullbacks in the centres. I hope it doesn't go as badly as it did for them last year when they had a 5/8 and fullback in the centres and they got torn apart because of it.
One of the strengths Queensland used to have is when you had a really dominant Queensland team in the NRL, you could sort of choose the core out of that, and that automatically gave you that sort of high level of understanding. With having sort of so-so Queensland teams at the moment, and I'll throw the Storm in there a little bit. I mean, they're quite dominant, but they're a bit more of a mix these days.
Mm-hmm.
That the selection is harder, and you tend to choose groups from across the team, so you don't necessarily have a core. So it's not necessarily as helpful. But sometimes it'll come down to, you know, where those relationships are. Do they fall at the right spot?
Yeah. And look, as a New South Wales fan, I'm so happy to see the end of that cohesion that Queensland had for about 10 years. I was sick of it.
I think the guy that got the most, I think, not let down by this, but anybody who coached New South Wales during this time, guys like Laurie Daly, got so, you know, sidelined. But fundamentally, there's nothing he could really have done.
Yeah.
And now it's like, now that Fittler took over,
mm-hmm.
and that New South Wales won, and Queensland dropped away by, like, say 70% or something, it might have been. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, Fittler's a genius because they're walking around without shoes on, and it's like there's no evidence any of that's making any difference whatsoever. The main thing is Queensland dropping off.
Yeah, exactly. I always felt like Craig Bellamy, who I always have felt like he was more focused on the Storm, and that he kind of fell into the New South Wales role a little bit because he was going so well with the Storm. I felt like he had some really good ideas as a coach. Like he had that very mobile team he named, but he's running up against this crazy juggernaut of a team that, you know, it's incredible to think that we went from State of Origin series where everything was locked up for 20 odd years, and then this Queensland team sort of all comes through at the same time. They're all about the same age. Most of them play for the one club, and they just roll through State of Origin for basically 10 years. Like, I mean, who saw that coming?
Yeah, and you know Bellamy's record, I think, is the second worst.
Yeah, terrible.
But that doesn't mean he's a bad coach.
Yeah,
I think that's where you really need to add some perspective on these guys. Is there's not really a whole bunch they can do, and I think that you know, I've had enough conversations with Mal. He says, I know I'm not a super coach, but I know what I had.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a great team that's not that difficult to run. No offense to Mal, of course, but he did a fantastic job of keeping it together.
Mm-hmm.
But it's certainly an easier task than coaching New South Wales.
Now, this season, it feels like it's a two-horse race to me. Does that bear out in the statistics that it's really Penrith or Storm and everyone else is just making up the numbers, or do you see the stats show that there are other teams that could win it?
I think that, Simon, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, what I'll do is obviously the Penrith are sitting pretty and they're doing quite well. And of course, they have the massive advantage that they are a New South Wales based team. So what I mentioned before about non-New South Wales teams having to win, they've got that advantage. And if they keep going, they're going to have a massive advantage in the future, where the interstate teams are going to have to be so good to try and break that advantage. So the Storm, while they are looking good, they are not as good as they have been previously. And so if they for some reason get an away final before the grand final, then there's the potential that they might fall. The way the numbers are sitting at the moment. Yeah, so there is that. So everything needs to go right for them for the rest of the season. Okay. Going through. So they are not set, I would say.
That's interesting.
So one of the things is that if you look across the history of the NRL, you get seasons where you have a lot of high quality teams, and you have seasons where you have some high quality, some poor quality. So for example, if you look at 1998, where we had 20 teams, you might have only had 3 or 4 teams capable of winning that grand final, and Broncos' numbers were just off the chart. Those years per se tend to get quite predictable in terms of the market. So this year we've actually seen a jump, not in only our model of its ability to be predictable, but also the market is actually a bit more predictable than normal. In other words, the odds on each game, they generally pick, I think the odds for the weekend's game where you had the Bulldogs, Penrith, I think was at $1 basically to Penrith. So you generally get more evenness across the competition. This year, there isn't as much evenness. There's some top teams and there's some bottom teams and there's the bits in between. But it's coming out more predictable, and our system's actually more predictable this year than it normally would be. So because when you get teams that are on the same level of cohesion, it comes down to the bounce of the ball, individual skill, things like that. So the other thing that's kind of interesting how it's played out is, a couple of years ago, I think we had our top 4 that we sort of said, okay, these are the teams we think will make it, which I think was Souths and Canberra. I can't remember the rest of the sides, but you could see that pretty early on. Really, this year you've got 2, and then you've got everybody else. You've got the Roosters who have got injury struggles. You've got the Eels who have reasonable numbers but aren't necessarily a high TWA club. And you've got Souths who've got reasonable numbers, except when they come up against really good teams, they do tend to battle a bit. Then you've got basically the rest, which are all over the place. Yeah. You've got Manly, when they bring Trbojevic back in, have that's really got their spine going. So they could theoretically jag it, as we call it. You come in and they might come up against the Storm, and the Storm have 2 or 3 injuries, their numbers plummet. We saw that with the Cowboys a couple of years ago. They were the best team in the comp, should win it. They lose Lynette Winterstein O'Neill. They lose their semi-final, they're out to the Roosters. So, sometimes you can be literally the best team in the comp and just line up wrong in the finals. But what's also happened is Canberra have gone from top 4 to now bottom 2 in the changes that have been made by Ricky deciding to take his senior players out of the team. So they haven't really underperformed this year, but they had one sort of bad game. Performance-wise, he changes his thinking in terms of who the guys are, and the one thing we know is we don't know what's going on. But their numbers are just rock bottom, so they're not actually underperforming. They've just changed their team so dramatically that they're not winning games that they would have won had they had their team earlier.
Yeah, and that's when he decided to. There was a couple of plays he just rested. I think it was after the Panthers game actually, where it all seemed to fall apart, and I was horrified by that, because I'm thinking that's the opposite of what he needs to be doing, because he had players that were, I think he had a couple of suspensions, somebody was injured, and then he rested players, and it was he's setting this up for failure.
Yeah, and that Penrith game, their numbers were good and they lost to a team they should have. Mm-hmm. And then they played the Eels. They made 4 changes to the team, lost that game. Then the next game they made 5 changes to the team, lost to the Cowboys. It just kept going.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to find the answer. They lose to South in a close one. They lose to Newcastle, but by then they'd come off almost 70% in terms of the numbers. So of course they're going to start losing those types of games, and you feel for them because no coach is wanting to lose it, and if he's trying to make a point, you can understand it. But that's when we get in these situations where sometimes it's one change actually grows into 5, grows into 10, mm-hmm. because the one change throws you off a bit, and then it keeps going, and then actually starts to steamroll.
Mm-hmm. So is this looking like the most lopsided NRL season we've had in some time?
Simon?
That's a good question. I think there is a big difference between the top and the bottom, mm-hmm. But there's not necessarily a lot of difference in that middle group. And so, like the eight's up for grabs. So the bottom, it's like the bottom 4 of the 8 is definitely up for grabs.
Yeah.
But come finals time, whether or not they will get through, I know Ben's been doing a bit of work lately on basically what you need to have during the season to put you in a position to be competitive at the end of the season, and there's not necessarily a lot of those teams that are genuinely competitive at the moment. But sometimes, team seasons are measured on whether or not they make the finals, because some of them are genuinely know that they're not necessarily grand final or premiership contenders. But there does seem to be a bit of difference. But there's a lot of coaching changes this year, and often that drives some of these things, because obviously a coach comes in and says, wants to make their mark and makes a fair few changes mm-hmm. through it. So there is a big difference between the top and the bottom for sure.
I think it's a case of the league is not a league in this way. So like the English Premiership is a league. So generally, if you ran it that way, the Storm and the Roosters probably would have won more comps mm-hmm. over the last period of time, because generally they will be number 1 or number 2 at the end of the season. But there's a final system to keep excitement, because it isn't a promotion relegation competition. Otherwise, it'd be pretty boring. So having finals, and then there's so many examples. You look at, say, when Manly won the comp, I think it was 07 or 08, and they lose Cameron Smith. In the preliminary final, the Storm lose him, and Manly put 40 on them in the final. Mm-hmm. There's many times the best team has not won the comp.
Yeah,
that happens pretty regularly, but that's the way it pans out. But it's also important to say, well, this team was not the best team all year, or the best team through the majority of games. That they were the best in the finals and within the context of this setup. So if you are a Sydney team and you make the 8, you're still a pretty good shot. And sometimes it might just come down to being, up against an interstate club who are not at their best. You win that game, you get another one in Sydney, away you go. Of course, the early preliminary games are outside of Sydney. But for example, if you're a Sydney team and you play another Sydney team, because when Sydney teams play each other, the home team only generally wins about 52% of the time. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's just how it lines up, and we've seen teams do it. And the other components to this is this is what I really liked about last year with COVID, is they had no state of origin break.
Yep.
It really messes with rounds 11 to 19, whatever it might be. And so sometimes it just becomes like, okay, we want to get the Storm, and we want to get, now it might be Penrith in the middle rounds. Mm-hmm. Because then we play against their poor teams. And so it's if the draw goes right. The other thing is if you get poor teams early in the year, you might win games against those poor teams, and then you sort of get convinced, okay, this is the team, and you hold with that group, and then you actually get this kind of level of cohesion that comes, because people generally overchange when they lose games and they underchange when they win. Mm-hmm. And so you just go on a run and off you go. So much of it is dependent upon the draw, So the key for us when we talk to clubs is we say, you're not going to win it every year. It's just not built that way. You just want to be able to put yourself in a position, no matter what the draw is or no matter what your injuries are, that you're in a good position to go okay anyway. And a bad year is a top four and a good year is winning a comp.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, especially in Australia, we've always had this, we've always liked the big final occasion sort of thing where we want to see you do it with the pressure on in the one game under the spotlight, and those moments where somebody does something absolutely crazy in a match and it is against the run. Like I think of Benji Marshall when he was throwing those flick passes as a teenager in the grand final in 2005. Like, we like to see those moments where an individual just rips the game open, and it's on that big stage. I think that in this part of the world we kind of value that a lot more than they do, say, over in England, where it is a first past the post sort of finish.
Yeah, and you have the drama of the situation. You had, Newcastle winning, in the greatest grand final of all time. Of course, I'd say that, thanks to Newcastle. 97. And you get those sort of fairy tales, but it isn't always fair on the club that's done things right. I mean, if Penrith don't win the comp this year, it'll either be something they did or something somebody else did, but it'll probably come down to injuries.
Yeah,
and if the draw comes out wrong or something, I can't really think of it any other reason. And
that's interesting because I've talked to people about last year, mostly Panthers fans, and so we're going to be biased, but I've yet to hear anybody say they felt like last season's grand final was a proper choke. But if we didn't win it this year, I think everyone would say they 100% have either they should win it. They really don't have excuses outside of, Cleary gets injured, touch wood, that doesn't happen, or some player on a different team does something absolutely ridiculous.
Well, I don't think Simon, saw it as a choke, did we? I think we probably felt Melbourne was the stronger of the two teams. You get chokes in the moment, but in terms of structure, Melbourne are pretty well set up. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just looking at it now. So we had the Storm to win that game. I'll tell you what, it's very different now. They're a very different side. They're very, very different setup.
Yeah, and Melbourne do look, going by everything you've said, it kind of confirms it. Melbourne, they're more vulnerable this year than they did look last year or have looked for a number of years, to be honest.
I think it's just amazing that they can lose all of those top four and still be there or thereabouts.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing for us we love about this, is that because they're following this kind of system, is that it's not about the who, it's about the how and the when and their construction. And so because they're following that, they continue to be successful. And all of a sudden there's another generation of kids that are becoming these geniuses and getting offered tons of money that may not have at other clubs themselves.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the stats that you have as well, they also back up one of the things that me and Andrew say is you never buy a player from the Melbourne Storm, because they're part of the system, and you take them out of that system and you're getting somebody that's probably not going to perform the same way they do in that Melbourne Storm system, unless their name is Greg Inglis, and then all bets are off.
Well, I think that really depends on a couple of things. One, the position.
Yep.
So wingers and fullbacks, that's more of a delivery position.
Yep.
Whereas, say, centre is another component. And then the other part is what are they going into?
Mm-hmm.
So when Cronk leaves the Storm, he goes from a high cohesion to a high cohesion club.
Yep.
First 6 weeks, their spine is terrible, but a spine is a smaller group of people than a whole team. So that's why defence takes longer to get understanding, because it's a whole 13 people working together, whereas a spine is the 4 guys working together. So, in football, they call it the Bayern Munich mirage, which is you take someone out of Bayern Munich and they'll never be the same again. So what you don't want is to take a player from a high cohesion club to a low cohesion club,
mm-hmm.
And particularly in a position where understanding is absolutely vital.
So just one question I have, and it's like out of left field. I might chuck this to you, Simon. Is there a team this year in the NRL outside of, say, the top, 2 or 3 teams that we should maybe look for to be a little bit surprising? Because I feel like we're going to have teams in the final series that just by the eye test, you're kind of going to think they're not a very good team, like a Dragons or I don't know, like even a team like the Warriors might make it, who are generally not thought of as a finals team. Is there somebody that stands out in the statistics that could maybe fill that role where they might end up in a crazy position like 6th place on the ladder, who people don't generally think of as a 6th place team, something along those lines?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because even if you look all the way down to 13th spot with Wests, you've got West, Sharks, Knights, Titans, Warriors, Dragons, Cowboys. They're all very similar, sort of putting out very similar markers at the moment. Mm-hmm. And it's a case of who can be consistent now through to the end of the season to actually take what they've got and really run with it. Because some teams out of that have the capacity to go backwards really quickly. Mm-hmm. Like the Warriors, for example, and I'll throw the Warriors under the bus a little bit. Like, you know, if there's one team that never utilised the origin period because they were probably the least affected, it was that team with it. They've never, you know, they've made one grand final. They've never been in a position to, by the markers. So basically, the markers you need to be truly competitive in the NRL, they've never really reached those markers in their entire history. Wow. Over that period of time. The best period of time that they were, you know, making grand finals, or making a grand final. Mm-hmm. And so they hopefully now, with the influence of, you know, if Gus is doing what he's doing there as he did at the Panthers, you know, they will be on a path going forward, because obviously there's no doubt they've got access to talent from that mm-hmm. perspective. The only issue they've got is they've, under their current leadership, they've got a bit of a reactive sort of selection policy depending on performance. It's sort of been shown over history. So it depends on how consistent they will be. You know, Dragons are putting together some good numbers. Potentially, you know, Anthony Griffin learnt from that period of time at the Panthers. He had in that intermediate period. Mm-hmm. From that, you know, the Cowboys have the ability to put some numbers together, but sort of they're coming from a low base. So, you know, it's actually really going to be around consistency and understanding of what they have and what they have to do to the end of the season. So the biggest surprise to me is actually Wests. The numbers that they're actually putting together now are really good considering where they've been over the last couple of years. But as Ben said, that they're probably coming a bit late, that mm-hmm. maybe they won't actually get to that 8. And if they do, they might do a very West thing and end up 9th.
Oh, please.
As they seem to do each season. So, you know, it'll be a really interesting scenario come the end of the year. But what I think will happen is by the time one of those, you know, from literally 6th down to 13th, whoever gets that group to fill those last few spots in the 8, by the time they get there, 1st through to 5th, you know, potentially might have taken those few steps ahead. Mm-hmm. Even further, yeah, and might be, you know, a few steps ahead come finals time.
One of the things. Sorry,
I've answered your question without really answering your question.
No, it's a great answer. Like, there really is that whole block of teams where I can see where, and this is where the Dragons are interesting, as you say, because the Dragons are performing. I think they're another team that are performing a little bit better than they did last year with worse talent on the field, but they're consistent and they're almost like an upgraded version of the Bulldogs under Dean Pay, in that they try really hard in games. And I guess that a lot of that comes down to their cohesion on the defensive side.
Yeah. And I think on top of that, just doing all that, I think the Broncos, what happens with that group above, mm-hmm. with some of those teams, I don't believe have the capacity to really take it on for the rest of the season, because I think they'll go, oh, this is not the right team, and they'll go and find the answer and their numbers will drop, mm-hmm. which means that the Broncos have some of those, sort of that group of 6 above them later in the season. So the Broncos, I think, have the capacity to pick up a few more games. Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the challenges they get is they'll go on a run and then they'll come up against a Penrith and then or a Penrith or a Storm, and they'll put 40 on them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly the right result.
Mm-hmm.
But they go, well, hang on, we've done poorly, therefore we need to make a change. Sometimes you just got to say, you know what? That's exactly where we are right now. We are a team that should lose to Penrith or the Storm by 30 or 40 points. Let's just leave that behind and let's move on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you can start to make the real progress. I didn't know what team Simon was going to say, but I'm in complete agreement about West's.
Mm-hmm.
When they come up against a good team and get beaten badly, that can often be the challenge for them. Interestingly, one of the things I've looked at as well recently is how many wins now does it take to guarantee yourself being in the 8?
Yep.
And because sometimes you'll get, for example, 4 or 5 teams on 12 wins. Some of those are inside the 8, some of those are outside the 8. And there has been years when, I think there was a year where the Roosters won 9 games and a couple of draws and somehow made, and of course the context of the 8 changes because you have, different numbers of teams in the competition. But generally that number now seems to be sitting at 14. 14 will guarantee you in, which is 28 points.
Mm-hmm.
But there are times when that might have you sitting in 4th place. There's times when that might have you sitting in 8th place.
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes making the 8 will come down to what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
And there are years where it's very even, and there's years where it's not even at all.
That's so interesting. And one very last question, and it's another left field one. I'm a basketball fan. I'm a Houston Rockets fan. I don't know if you've covered the NBA, but I can't imagine a team has ever fallen off in terms of their cohesion number from one season to another, quite like the Rockets have. Do you cover the NBA?
Not as intensely as we do the NRL and the other codes here in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
We've just got some basic markers, and to be honest, we haven't really looked at this season that much. But there's definitely signals. There's definitely signals from a TWI perspective, that, and like Ben talked about from a spine, that small group of people can get cohesion up quick.
Yep.
Similar 5 on the court, eight sort of people that tend to spend the most time on the court.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely some similarities there. But it sounds like, have they had a high turnover of people?
They basically were a different team by the end of the year.
Yeah, that doesn't help. It doesn't help, and you get these scenarios where we've got a new roster, let's play for a few games, or that's not working. Well, let's change the roster, change the starting. If you're always on this constant churn, so you can never actually get better. And as you're not getting better, everyone else is getting better.
Yep.
During that period of time, so it's.
I'd say generally the NBA has been dropping. I remember hearing, I think Marv Allen, the commentator, saying, after Chicago finished, so this is the end of the dynasties.
Yep.
I think probably 2 of the examples we'd say of low cohesion, not amazing talent. High cohesion, not amazing talent, was Detroit Pistons.
Yep.
Their sort of heyday, the bad boys, prior to the Chicago dynasty, and then San Antonio Spurs.
Yeah.
No one's really built themselves up in the same way since the Spurs kind of came off a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
There were definitely some signals into Milwaukee a couple of seasons ago, and the Raptors during that period of time through TWI. But like NBA, like most American sports, has very much become the sort of the cult of the individual. But in the NBA, it's the cult of the pair and the cult of the triple at the moment, the way they're putting their teams together. So, but if you've got enough talent, being a 5-man sport, an individual talent or a pair of talents can sort of really shift the game quite a bit.
It's very different. Yeah. Sorry, what was that, Ben?
If you play 70 games, in the NRL we're taking 13 people over 20 games or 25 games. The NBA you're taking 3 people and giving them 70 games.
Yeah.
It's easier to build that understanding.
Yeah, and you get an example of the Lakers. You rest LeBron for a period of time, and you will you'll scrape into the playoffs. LeBron comes back, and then you'll the aim is to get through. Mm-hmm. So
I think just a quick earlier point I was going to make on the NRL too is you have teams sometimes that have injuries, but they'll have a good team in the bank.
Yeah.
So inside their squad there is a good team waiting, and if you can just get them back onto the field, they'll be a strong side. So that's really the Roosters right now. They're not fielding a very good team, but they still have a good team in the bank.
Yeah.
And if they can get them back on, they've got a shot. But obviously now they've lost, I think, Friend for the year and then other guys. Then that's not really plausible.
Okay. Wow. Look, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I could talk to you for another hour about all sorts of random sports and teams and trying to find the ones that stand out in your statistics and ones that like have fallen away. It's just incredible to know that you've found a system that really shows what's happening on the field and things that you see with the eye test. The statistics definitely show that, and in many cases show that before people sort of cotton on to what's happening. The West Tigers one, man, I'm going to start tipping them a lot more against worse teams because they're killing my tipping at the moment. I don't know what to do with the West Tigers at the moment, so you've sorted that out for me, which is great.
The State of Origin teams just come out.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You want me to read it out to you?
Yeah, read it out.
So, Jai Arrow, AJ Brimson, Kurt Capewell, DCE, Xavier Coates, Tino Fasamale, I don't know how to pronounce that properly.
Yeah.
Kyle Felt, David Fafita, Moika Fotokai. This is all my worst pronunciations of all time. I apologise to
I do the same.
Polynesian listeners. Dane Gagai, Harry Grant, Cohen Hess, Valentine Holmes, Kafusi, Felicia Kafusi, Reed Mahoney, Cameron Munster, Joe Offhand-Gowie, Kalen Ponga, Jaden Sewer, Christian Welch.
That's interesting. So they've gone Mahoney at hooker instead of Harry Grant, by the look of it.
Well, Harry Grant's in the team.
Is he? Okay.
He'll be a backup.
Yep.
Yeah. So it depends. I think that's in alphabetical order, so it's not obviously giving us any more information.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that? It feels very much like the team last year, which it always was going to. There's no real surprises for me.
It's interesting that Queensland always had a philosophy built on this notion of loyalty, to those who've performed before, whereas New South Wales tended to run by form. And the difficulty is with form is only really team specific.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at how Darius Boyd played for Newcastle, when he was there, he struggled, on and off the field, poor bloke. But when he turned up for Queensland, it was outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's an error to just looking at form without context of the environment the player's in. And Queensland, one of the reasons they've tended to go down this loyalty path is, one, it worked. Two, there's no one else because they're so limited in their choices. So
yeah, it's shocking when you see the player pool that they actually are selecting from. It is very, very small.
Well, we see that as a huge advantage.
Oh, yeah.
We see it as a disadvantage. We see it as an advantage. And, for example, in Olympic sports, there's an inverse correlation between the size of the pool available and the success of the team. So the USA, for example, does not do well in team sports in the Olympics.
Yeah.
Comparative to, say, New Zealand, who win like 40% of their gold medals in team sports. New Zealand's not a great country on individual sports. On team sports, they smash it.
Yeah.
So it's when you don't have a choice, you keep picking the same guys, and they eventually come into form.
Yeah.
So it's just a different way of looking at it, but it's not a bad thing for Queensland. I think it'll work okay.
Yeah. If there was any sort of rating that you have for a player, that it doesn't matter what their club form says, they could still be picked for a rep team. It should be called the Dale Shearer rating. 100.
Well, again, where did Rowdy play? Wasn't he a winger or a fullback? Am I wrong in saying that?
Yeah, he was, yeah.
Yeah. So that's that ability to deliver. God bless him, Rowdy. No matter if he was at the Crushers, I think he was at the Crushers at one stage. He went to a bunch of different teams, but he that ability to deliver, and that's why oftentimes that the low cohesion clubs will provide the players in non-cohesive positions.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll often provide the props and the wingers, whereas the other well-run clubs will provide the spines.
Okay, that's so interesting. Look, thank you both for coming on. It has been a really fascinating discussion. First of all, Simon, where can we find you? Do you have a Twitter account? Do you have a website, an outlet of some sort outside of Gainline Analytics?
I do. Simon at PTG is my Twitter account. I don't necessarily use it a lot. I'm actually basically run all the social media through Gainline Analytics at GL Analytics. I use my Twitter account on occasion myself. But basically I run all the social media and all the newsletter and the website and all that other stuff. LinkedIn account, Facebook, etc. for Gainline. So
Simon doesn't let me near the social media because I get too heated at people. So
no, if he ran it, every second tweet would be about kids' nappies and what he bought at the shops.
Yeah.
So.
As soon as the lockdown came in, I saw him talking about, the kids are going to be homeschooled and all that sort of stuff.
Killing me.
Beautiful. Spending time with the kids, it's just a wonderful time. I'm happy to be alive.
So where can we find you, Ben?
I'm at Ben Darwin on Twitter and LinkedIn, but again, if we've got a Facebook page, we've got a Twitter page for Gainline Analytics, and we've got a website which is gainline.biz. Am I right, that Simon?
That's right. And and people they can go to the web page and sign up for our e-newsletter, which comes out every month or two or three, depending on how busy.
I just also make mention of how unbelievable a resource Rugby League project has been for us. It's so rare in world sport because most sports will have multiple feeders with multiple names of players and create, multiple systems where the data is. And so for us to have Rugby League project, and we're a supporter of Rugby League project, it's just incredible a resource, and it's really made it possible for us to be able to do our work. So they're really extraordinary.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I always say on the podcast, it's a website that every single one of us uses at some point. If you're in rugby league, you've got any interest in it, at some point you've gone to that website, and it really is incredible. And I've seen the work Andrew's done, and it is constant. He's always putting statistics up, not only for this week's games in multiple leagues, but going back, decades. He's always building upon the base that they've got there, and it really is. It's incredible.
Yeah, the fact that they've got team lists back now to 74, it just allows us to look at, years like 1985, 1986, and how good Parramatta were, for example. It allows us to build that information because we need minimum, 10, 15 years of data to pick that up. So, and if you ever want to know about Leeds, second division, it's there. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it's look, Andrew would have been on today, but he's created another human being lately, so he's bringing that up. I said to him he's got 2 or 3 weeks of that, and then he's got to come back on. So we'll see how he goes.
Well, for the sake of rugby league, he needs to stop doing that.
Yeah, I agree. He needs to stop being selfish about it, quite honestly. Look, thank you both for coming on. It's been a fantastic episode. We will no doubt have you both on again. If the Panthers lose the grand final, look, I need to hold someone responsible, so it might as well be you two. But yeah, thanks once again for coming on, both of you.
Pleasure.
No worries, Freaky.
Thanks, Freaky.
And thanks for everyone for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.